If you're a high-achieving woman who's exhausted by stress, stuck in constant conflict, and tired of being overlooked in the exact rooms where you know you were born to lead, then this podcast is for you. So here's your host, Pallavi Jain.
Welcome back to Her Boss Brain. I'm Pallavi Jain, your host, leadership strategist, TEDx speaker, and founder of the Lead From Within program. Let me ask you something. Have you ever reached the end of a day and wondered, how did I work this hard and still not get to the thing that mattered most? Or looked at your calendar and thought, I've been in meetings all day, but what did I actually move forward? Or maybe you have had one of those weeks where you're constantly busy, constantly responding, constantly doing, and yet somehow you're no closer to the results you want. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. As I was preparing for this episode, I found myself laughing a little because I realized how often I've fallen into this trap myself. Just a few months ago, I had one of those days where I felt incredibly productive. I had answered emails, recorded content, worked on my website, updated a presentation, responded to messages, scheduled meetings, and literally I've crossed out a whole bunch of things off my list, and that's a great feeling. And at the end of the day, I sat down and I asked myself a simple question. What actually moved forward today? And honestly, I struggled to answer it. I had been active all day, but I hadn't necessarily made meaningful progress. And that's when it hit me. Sometimes busyness feels productive because movement gives us the sense of accomplishment, but movement and progress are not the same thing. And I think many of us know exactly what that feels like. And today I want to explore something that completely changed how I think about performance, leadership, and success. Because what if the problem isn't that you're not working hard enough? What if the problem is that you have lost clarity? Because I've come to realize something. Busy and productive are not the same thing. And in today's world, we confuse them all the time. I remember periods during my corporate career when my calendar looked like a game of Tetris, back-to-back meetings, emails, escalations, deadlines, requests coming from every direction, right? And by the end of the day, I was exhausted. The strange thing was that exhaustion felt like proof that I had been productive. After all, I'm tired. I must have accomplished something, right? But when I really stopped and looked at it honestly, many days I wasn't moving the most important things forward. I was moving the most urgent things forward. And those are not always the same thing. Actually, one coaching conversations comes to mind as I'm talking about this. A client was preparing for a performance review conversation with one of her direct reports, and she was dreading it, like many of us, right? Not because the employee wasn't working hard. Actually, the opposite. This employee was incredibly hardworking. She was dedicated, responsive, always busy, always doing something. And in fact, when my client shared her self assessment with me, it was glowing. She genuinely believed that she was performing exceptionally well. But the problem was that my client saw something very differently. She didn't believe that. The most important deliverables weren't being met from her vantage point. Key outcomes were slipping, right? So the work being done wasn't translating into the results the team needed. And during one of our coaching conversations, my client asked me that, well, I don't know, how do I even approach this conversation? Because, she's putting a lot of work. And my first thought was actually this, that if your employee is going to be completely surprised by this feedback, that's a leadership issue. Performance reviews should never be the first time someone hears where they stand. Those conversations need to happen throughout the year. But nevertheless, as we dug deeper, something interesting emerged that the issue wasn't effort. The issue wasn't that this employee was not committed or not capable. The issue was clarity. Both people were operating with very different definitions of success. The employee was spending enormous amounts of time perfecting details, tweaking presentations, right? Adjusting formatting, making things look polished. And while those things weren't unimportant, they weren't the things that would ultimately determine success. The real question was, were we advancing the strategy? Were we moving key outcomes forward? Were we solving the right problem? And somewhere along the way, activity had become confused with impact. Busyness had become confused with effectiveness. And honestly, I think many of us fall into that trap these days. And if you're thinking this is just a personal productivity problem, it's not. Organizations around the world are wrestling with the same challenge. Research consistently shows that role clarity is one of the strongest predictors of employee engagement, performance, and well being. In fact, I was just having a conversation with a CPO in a health organization, and she was able to retain her staff through various massive disruptions. And she attested to that she was able to do that because she was very intentional about creating that role clarity: who is doing what, who is accountable for what. And that was a game changer for her. And yet, most workplaces are operating in environments where priorities shift constantly. Information never stops coming, and attention is being pulled in multiple directions. So the issue isn't simply workload, it's whether people know what matters most. Because when everything feels important, nothing actually gets the attention it deserves. I think one of the biggest risks in today's world is that we become incredibly efficient at climbing the wrong mountain. We optimize, we hustle, we work longer, we become more productive. But every now and then, we literally need to stop and ask, is this even the mountain I wanted to climb? Because clarity isn't just helping us move faster, it's making sure we're moving in the right direction. And I found that many people aren't exhausted because they're working too hard. They're exhausted because they're working hard on things that actually don't matter. The thing is, losing clarity doesn't happen dramatically. It happens quietly. You stop asking what matters most, and you just keep asking, what should I do next? So you stop focusing on outcomes and you start reacting to whatever is in front of you: the next email, the next request, the next meeting, the next fire to put out. And before you know it, you're busy all day, but not necessarily moving in the direction you want to go. What fascinates me is that neuroscience actually explains this. So, our brains are designed to conserve energy. So, when we're overloaded, they naturally shift toward reacting rather than prioritizing. Our working memory becomes crowded. And that's why decision quality declines. Attention becomes fragmented. Researchers call part of this phenomena attention residue. So, when you switch from one task to another, part of your attention remains stuck on the previous task. So, you're physically in the meeting, but mentally still in the email. You're responding to the email while thinking about tomorrow's presentation. You're in the presentation worrying about a deadline later that afternoon. And studies have found that after an interruption, right, it can take more than 20 minutes to fully regain focus on the original task. So, no wonder so many people at the end of the day are feeling mentally drained. Their brains have been context switching all day long. But here's the part nobody talks about enough. The cost isn't just productivity. The cost is emotional. When clarity starts to disappear, everything feels harder. You start second guessing yourself. You revisit decisions you've already made. You wonder if you are focusing on the right things, and you become more reactive, more overwhelmed, more frustrated. And over time, confidence starts to erode. Not because you're incapable, not because you're lazy, but because you've lost the filter that helps you distinguish what truly matters from everything else competing for your attention. And when that happens, everything begins to feel urgent, right? And that's an exhausting way to live and work. As I work with senior leaders and executives, I've noticed something else. And I think this is important to point out. The cost of losing clarity grows with influence. What do I mean? When an individual loses clarity, they waste time. When a manager loses clarity, a team loses time. But when an executive loses clarity, entire organization lose momentum. I've seen organizations where everyone is working incredibly hard. Calendars are full, projects are moving, meetings are happening, yet nobody can clearly articulate the top 3 priorities. And when that happens, something dangerous occurs. People become busy aligning with their own assumptions rather than a shared direction. This is this activity overload and outcome starvation. Everyone is moving, but not necessarily toward the same destination. And that's why clarity is one of the highest return on investments a leader can make. Because clarity scales, But remember, confusion scales too. One thing I've learned is this: people rarely become aligned accidentally. Alignment is a leadership responsibility. You know, if you have 10 people on your team and they have 10 different definitions of success, you don't have an execution problem. You have a clarity problem. And every time clarity increases, something powerful happens. Decision making actually becomes easier. Priorities become clearer. Accountability improves, which a lot of leaders complain about. And conflict decreases. People stop wasting energy and time trying to figure out what matters and start directing that energy toward meaningful outcomes. I actually remember sitting in executive meetings where smart, capable leaders spend for like 45 minutes debating solutions. And halfway through the discussion, it became obvious that the real issue wasn't the solution. The real issue was that people weren't solving the same problem. Everyone had a different understanding of what success looked like. And once that became clear, the conversation changed completely. And by the way, not because all of a sudden anyone became smarter, but because everyone finally got aligned. You know what losing clarity reminds me of? It's like getting into your car and driving all day without entering a destination into your GPS. So you can be moving constantly, you can burn a lot of fuel, you can feel busy, but movement without direction doesn't guarantee progress. In fact, you might end up farther away from where you actually wanted to go, right? And I think that's what happens to many professionals and organizations. They're constantly moving, working, responding, attending meetings, checking boxes, but somewhere along the way, they stopped asking, where exactly are we trying to go? Because clarity isn't speed. Clarity is direction. And speed without direction simply gets you lost faster. This is where the boss brain becomes so important. Being on self-start doesn't mean doing everything. It means consciously directing your energy instead of allowing your environment to direct it for you. So let me leave you with a few simple boss brain moves, okay, that you can start doing right now. The first is this: before starting your day, identify the one outcome that would make the day meaningful. Not 10 things, 20, just one, right? What's the most important thing to move forward today? The second is to pause when you feel overwhelmed and ask yourself, am I being productive right now, or am I simply being busy? And the third question is one of my favorite. What am I saying yes to that is pulling me away from what actually matters? Because every yes is also a no to something else. So as we close today, I want to leave you with a question, not how busy are you or how much is on your plate. Instead, ask this question, okay? If you're a leader, if I asked every person on my team what success looks like over the next 90 days, how similar would their answers be? You would be amazed how revealing this question would be, because the distance between those answers is often the distance between effort and execution. And the distance between effort and execution is often a clarity gap. You know, one of the biggest lessons I've learned over the years is that most people are not struggling because they don't care, because they're lazy, or, because they lack talent. Most of the time, they're simply caring too much, reacting too much, and trying to make sense of too many competing priorities all at once. I've been there. Maybe you're there right now, right? And if you are, I want to remind you of something. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need to have a perfect plan. You don't need to work harder. Sometimes the next breakthrough comes from getting quieter, not busier, from stepping back long enough to ask, what actually matters most right now? Because clarity is what turns effort into impact. Clarity is what turns motion into progress. And clarity is what allows us to show up with confidence, make better decisions, and lead ourselves and others more effectively. So if this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who might need the reminder too. Until next time, I want you to keep activating your boss brain, keep leading from within, and keep moving forward toward what matters most. Take care, everyone. I'll see you next week.
So that's it for today's episode of our Boss Brain podcast. Head on over to Apple Podcasts, iTunes, or wherever you listen and subscribe to the show. One lucky listener every single week. that posts a review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes will win a chance in a grand prize drawing to win a $25,000 private VIP day with Pallavi herself. Be sure to head on over to herbossbrainpodcast.com and pick up a free copy of Pallavi's gift and join us next time.